That is the 97th anniversary of the Great October Socialist Revolution. I'm sure we have a lot of people in the crowd who are out here precisely because of that event to mark it. We're particularly pleased to have people coming back for homecoming, if there are such people here in the audience, welcome. And we're also very pleased to have our colleagues from Embry-Riddle University in Daytona from the Security Studies class, who for us are on the screen here. Welcome, and we hope this will be the first of many such ventures between Stetson and Embry-Riddle. Students, a reminder for you that cultural credit is provided for this if you would like it, and it will be around 5 o'clock. Who is going to be doing it? Andre, back there towards the back. So if you're needing to leave at 5 o'clock, if you'll just sort of go out that back exit, that would be helpful. Okay, we are delighted to welcome today Dr. Marlene Laruelle from George Washington University, from the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, part of the Elliott School at George Washington University. Dr. Laruelle received most of her undergraduate and graduate degrees in France at the Institut National des Langues et Civilisations Orientales, which is probably, certainly on the continent, I think of it as the most impressive place to do non-European languages and cultures and politics. She is a prolific author of works in English, French, and Russian on ethnicity, nationalism, and geopolitics, involving territories that sweep from Eastern Europe through Russia out to China. Her work, which I like very much, is firmly grounded in field research, and she spent significant periods of time, and I won't list maybe all of them, but Czech Republic, Slovakia, Ukraine, Russia, Turkey, Central Asia, India, and Japan. This work has been supported by numerous governmental and non-governmental organizations, including the United States State Department, the French Ministry of Defense, the Swedish Foreign Ministry, the Smith-Richardson Foundation, and the Open Society Institute. We're delighted that Dr. Laruelle is with us today to speak about the crisis in Ukraine and Russia's ideological landscape. Welcome, Marlene.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here today, indeed, on a Friday afternoon. My great pleasure to be here. So I thought that for the lecture of today it would be good to come back to the Ukrainian crisis, and I will be looking not at what is happening in Ukraine, but what is happening in Russia and how it is impacted the Putin regime, and especially the way Russia, the Russian state and the Russian society discuss their national identity issues, because it's very much something which is important to understand the Ukrainian crisis. So first, I would very briefly present the Ukrainian crisis seen from Moscow, so you can have an idea of the way Moscow understood the crisis and react on the way it reacted. Then I will be looking at the general context in which the crisis happened in Russia, and especially the issues of Putin's regime legitimacy and the domestic context that is going around. And then I will be looking in the third part about how the ideological landscape has been reshaped by the crisis, and what does it mean on the long term for Russia and Russia's relation to the West. So first point about the Ukrainian crisis seen from Moscow. I think we are wrong when we try to interpret a Russian position as being a purely aggressive and very reactive position. All, Hillary Clinton narrative about Russia is trying to recreate the Soviet Union. I think it's a mistake of interpretation. Russia is very much on a defensive position. Russia is interested in preserving, in freezing the post-Soviet order as it is now, and hoping that it will not collapse further away. I think that the Russian elites, and especially the current regime, are very much aware that it's much more difficult to reconquer something you lost than just to try to freeze the situation as it is. So one of the main goals of the regime in trying to freeze the post-Soviet order was to develop what they call the Eurasian Union project. We would be a very kind of soft system of your economic union, possibly, if everything goes well, which it will not, would have some supranational political institution that would be in favor of Russia, but probably that will not happen. So this custom union, Eurasian Union project, is very much something to freeze the post-Soviet order, especially in relation to the Central Asian countries, which are more and more developing trade with China. So it's a way to slow down the Chinese influence in the region. And then the Ukrainian crisis happened. And understood from the Russian perspective, Ukraine has been committed to crimes. The first one is that Russia has always, the Putin regime has always been very clear in what was the red line for Ukraine not to be crossed. Is that Ukraine can be an independent country and Russia will not try to take it back only if Ukraine remains a friendly country with Russia and try to stay in Russia's geopolitical framework. The day the Putin regime felt that the Ukrainian regime was collapsing and therefore the new regime coming from the Maidan, the street revolution, will be moving toward the European Union and an agreement with it, then it considered that the red line has been crossed and the price to pay has been to take Crimea. Why Crimea? Because first it was easy to do for several historical and administrative regions that make Crimea a very specific part of Ukraine, but also because the Russian elites, and we may consider that they were wrong in their interpretation, but that's our own analysis. Their own analysis is different, is that they consider that Ukraine moving toward the European Union would be also a fact of Ukraine moving toward NATO, or NATO moving toward Ukraine, and therefore that on the long-term perspective, probably Sebastopol, the main big city in Crimea, and the one where the Russian military, where the Russian has its biggest fleet in the Black Sea, that this region will one day or another probably be a NATO territory or would welcome a NATO military basis. And I think that was considered by Russia and something that was just unacceptable. And the easiest solution was just to take it back. So that the first crimes that Ukraine committed, which is to move toward the west, that was considered as a red line for Russia. The second crimes of Ukraine is to be badly governed and to experience regularly street revolution or color revolution that the Russian regime interprets as coup. And that's very clear that seen from the Kremlin, political instability in the name of democratization, especially when it is inspired by Western value and possibly funded by Western money, and that's very much part of the Russian narrative. It's the direct route to domestic chaos, lost sovereignty, and so on. And it was clearly a kind of mirror effect for the Putin regime to be afraid of having to face the same kind of color revolution at home, and therefore to avoid or to demonstrate that having this kind of color revolution and democratic revolution means a failing state and a chaotic state. One of the solutions to weaken this democratic Ukraine was to contribute to create a new secessionist conflict, a new frozen conflict in supporting insurgency in eastern Ukraine. So Crimea was taken probably mostly in relationship to Sebastopol and the risk of having this region becoming part of NATO. And eastern Ukraine insurgency was supported by Russia, probably with the idea that on the long-term perspective, the goal is to show that the more you are a democratic country with a regular revolution, the weaker you are and you can lose part of your sovereignty. So two very different strategies for what we have seen as one element, but the chain of events is very clear seen from the Russian side, which is that Ukraine lost part of its territory because it had a democratic revolution. Without a democratic revolution, without a Maidan in Kiev, Ukraine would still be a unified country. So they pay the price of their own revolution, and that's really the way the Russian state formulated that. So if Russia was really driven by ideological goals and by nationalism, as it was often said in Western media, then it would have occupied eastern Ukraine. If really the goal of Russia was to reunify the Soviet territory or really to protect Russian minorities abroad, then why taken eastern Ukraine? Well, I think precisely because Putin's goal is not to reunify Soviet Union or to protect Russian minority. it's to freeze its geopolitical order and be sure it will either be in control of Ukraine or Ukraine will be weakened as a state and not be able to move toward the West. So I think that's a in fact, that's relatively classic strategy for a regional hegemon, but we tend always to interpret it when we speak about Russia as a nationalist element, but it's just a strategy of an hegemonic power, and many countries in the world, including the US, have been using minorities in several other countries in the world when they have to negotiate with a non-friendly government. Then you try to weaken this non-friendly government with people who are on your side. So Russia is not really doing something different, except that it's doing it on its own former imperial territory, and therefore we interpret it as being a nationalism. So I think nationalism is a tool of the Russian regime, and it has been used as a tool for the Ukrainian crisis, but it's not really the agenda of the regime. The agenda of the regime is not nationalism, it's just a tool of it. Everything happened, and I will now move to this second part.
Oh, that's very good of you.
Everything happened in a very specific context in Russia, which is that Putin was a very popular leader in the 2000s, as you know, and he's still relatively popular. But when he came back to power in 2012, he came back in a very specific context that he was really not prepared to, which was that he had to face several months of anti-Putin, anti-regime protests. And that was the first time in the history of Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union that someone so popular as him had to face this big scale anti-Putin regime, anti-Putin protests. So he really arrived with this idea that suddenly his regime was potentially at risk, and he has to be sure domestic stability and the security of the regime will be ensured. And I think that's really one of his main goals. And to give you some kind of sociological feedback, when we look at surveys that are done in Russia in terms of popularity of Putin's before the Ukrainian crisis, we could really see how big cities, Moscow, St. Petersburg, middle classes, upper classes were more and more distrustful toward the regime. So you really had two Russia. You had one Russia very supportive of Putin, people from provincial cities, people living in in region with depressed economy, but the middle classes, the most active politically citizen in Moscow and St. Petersburg were very distrustful of the regime. And in fact, even since 2012, all those kind of, municipal election or regional election that has been organized in Russia, and you know that they are not democratic election, they are huge political pressure done by the state to be sure that the presidential party, United Russia, will arrive first. Well, the number that we have for Moscow and St. Petersburg is between 45 and 60% of support for the presidential party. Well, for non-free and fair elections that are organized by the presidential party himself, it's really not a big result, which really means that there is a growing distrust among middle classes toward the regime until the crisis happened. So to react, to respond to this decreasing legitimacy of the regime in Russia, Putin decided to move toward what has been called a conservative turn in terms of politics. So Masha Lipman, who is who has been during years a scholar at the Carnegie Center in Moscow, published a very good article when she was explaining that during all the 2000s, there was kind of implicit compact between the Russian society and the regime. And the pact was that the state doesn't intervene in the private life of citizens, and in exchange, citizens doesn't participate in the political life. The day this implicit contract was broken, because these middle classes went in the street to protest against the regime, Putin considered that the implicit contract has been broken, and therefore he had to move toward something more explicit in terms of ideology, and he decided to rely increasingly on the conservative majority of his own electorate to try to marginalize the active minority with more liberal values. And the way to marginalize this minority with liberal values was to formulate a narrative where liberal values would be considered as decadent, immoral, and the timing was good for the regime because that's the moment where both in Russia and in Europe you had a lot of discussion about gay marriage, LGBT rights, and therefore that became one of the key elements for the Putin regime to build a narrative about, or look at this European liberals country who are promoting decadent values while we should go back to the real Christian, authentic, family-oriented values. And therefore, that's what has been called the conservative turn or the morality turn of the regime, which became very visible in 2012. So really just after the anti-Putin protests, even if it was already there in the atmosphere very visibly. And in 2013, when Putin was speaking at Valdai, you know, this big meeting organized by Russia, he has a very impressive speech where he said, and I will just quote him, "We can see how many of the European Atlantic countries are actually rejecting their roots, including the Christian values that constitute the basis of Western civilization. They are denying moral principle and all traditional identities, national, cultural, religious, and even sexual." And that's really become an interesting turn because until then, the Putin regime was relatively flexible in terms of ideology. Putin was not very much, he always wanted to be seen as a very pragmatic leader, of a good strategist, but not someone promoting a specific set of values. With the 2012, there is really a turn toward what has been called conservative values. And that's interesting because, as I said, it's something visible since 2012, but it's not something new. And in fact, it's arrived in the Russian society since the early 2000s. It was mostly promoted by the Russian Orthodox Church, which is really playing a growing role in the public sphere of Russia. And Russia is an interesting case because if you look at statistics, you have between 2 and 5% of the Russian population who go to church every week. So it's not a religious population, but it's a population where the cultural or political legitimacy of the church as an institution is still very strong, or has been again very strong since the collapse of the Soviet regime. So the church has been promoting this narrative all over the 2000s, with the regime sometimes following it, sometimes not following it. But since 2012, it really became kind of official narrative, presenting Russia as the savior of traditional Christian values, and the Russian Orthodox Church in particular has been particularly active in working both with Catholic and Protestant movement in Europe and with the radical right in the US in trying to develop connection around these Christian values. And just to give you an example, in 2010, the main representative of the Russian Orthodox Church was speaking to US evangelists here in the US in Dallas, and he mentioned this long-term idea, and I quote him, of a strategic alliance of Orthodox Christian, Catholic, and traditional Protestants, all of those who defend the true Christian values. So this conservative term that at the beginning had a domestic values, which is to marginalize the liberal inside the domestic scene, as it has also this kind of branding or PR action for Russia abroad. It's also helped Russia to find new allies in the West, because globally Russia has relatively few allies in the West, in Europe and the US, until it was able to develop this conservative narrative that really now have made that Russia has some friend in the US rights, which doesn't seem to be logical geopolitically. And also, Russia has been able to build a lot of new partnership with European populist or far-right party, and especially during the Ukrainian crisis, it was very visible that everywhere in Western and Central Europe, all the far-right party have a clearly pro-Russian and pro-Putinian stance. So it's a double strategy, both domestically in terms of controlling the domestic legitimacy of the regime, and in trying to build a voice of Russia that would make sense abroad and that would make Russia having new partners geopolitically. And that has been a relatively successful strategy. The other strategy that Russia has been built is to develop a narrative about how state sovereignty is important and should be the main element of international affairs. And you see it on the way Russia is managing the Syrian crisis, for example. This idea that a regime is legitimate until the last moment, and no street revolution democratic or Islamist can be considered as legitimate, and therefore Russia will stand for Syria and Bashar al-Assad until the last moment. So a very well-developed strategies that make Russia more and more an ideological actor, an actor promoting, having his own ideology of international affairs and trying to promote it globally, with discussing with a lot of Muslim countries, of course, who can share the same kind of narrative. So that's the general context in which the Ukrainian crisis appeared, and that Russia has been interpreting exactly, relatively consistently with its own narrative, which is that what happened in Ukraine was illegitimate. You cannot change a regime from a street action, and therefore, during months, Russia has been saying that there is no legitimate political actor I can speak to in Kiev, therefore I will manage the situation on the ground in eastern Ukraine as I want. So all these elements happened also in a big reshaping of the ideological landscape inside Russia and the way the Russian society has been debating about its national identity. And that will be my third part. And here, maybe just some general elements of to give you the framework of the discussion for those of you who are not familiar with these Russian debates about national identity. It's always very complex in the Russian case because Russia is something, it's no more an empire, it's not really a nation state. They have been navigating between the two narratives and the two interpretations during decades, if not centuries. And that makes the debates about national identity a very complex one. So you have people who consider that Russia is still an empire and therefore should be open to the world and have a very messianic narrative about its place in the world. You have people who would be more in favor of just a kind of geopolitical view of the world. The West and the US are the danger, and Russia should be a kind of new Soviet Union, so not really expanding, but trying to resist to the Western influence and fighting geopolitically against the US. You have people who have a very ethnicized definition of their own Russian identity and who are afraid of migrants coming to the country. So all these elements are part of the debates, and sometimes, even for us scholars, it's difficult to define how we want to, which kind of terminology we want to use for these groups. Do we want all call them nationalists and dissociate it between the imperial nationalist and the ethnic nationalist, or do we want to say nationalist only for those who promote ethnic nationalism, and therefore the other would be imperialistic or neo-Soviet proponent? I mean, so the terminology is very complex, and the regime himself is really playing on these kind of ambiguities. And Putin has been very good since the 2000s in trying not to officialize any national ideology. So he's playing different cards, different groups at the same time. He has very contradictory narrative. In Russian also you have two terms to define Russian, Ruski and Rossiyski. Ruski, so the first term to define Russian means more kind of ethnic or linguistic or cultural definition of Russianness. The other, Rossiyski, means more a civic definition of the state. So that would, for example, welcome non-ethnic Russian as Russian citizen. Putin has been using the two terminology in a way that are really changeable. And we as scholars, we always try to find an explanation, a rationality. We study all the speeches and we try to classify, to know at what moment is using one or the other. Well, difficult to say if there is really a rationality around that. That's something that is not demonstrable, and maybe we are just trying to create rationality where, in fact, there is a mutual way of using both terms. Another aspect which is important into these debates on national identity is that we always tend to see it top down. So it's the regime trying to create a national ideology, and that will impact the society. But in fact, the society is also having its own debates about national identity, and sometimes they try to impact the regime. So you have these two kind of trends, they also meet, that sometimes the regimes think they have to interpret what the society is probably telling or speaking, and that's something interesting because this regime, as many authoritarian regimes, they lack information about what is going on in their own society. And they know very well that they lack information, so they need to try to create room to know what people really think if they cannot express it publicly. So what we have been noticing in Russia is that the state is more and more commissioning national ideologies. You have more and more institute or think tank or clubs that are developing narrative about what is Russian national identity, and very often they receive money from the state or from several ministries or from the military-industrial complex, but sometimes they also receive money from private actors. So that creates a plurality of people who try to influence the way the Russian state will formulate its identity. The church itself has its own narrative, which is not exactly the state narrative. It's slightly different. So many actors having their own nationalistic voice. And then you have what is going on the ground. You have nationalism developing from below. And one of the most visible nationalism from below was the growing movement of skinheads in the 2000s, and now more globally of what is called xenophobia or migrantophobia, which is a Russian term created on mixing migrant and phobia. This movement is relatively powerful. Russia has been #1 in the world in terms of skinheads, number of skinheads in the 2000s. That was several tens of thousands of them, around 50,000, 60,000. Now there are less because the regime is trying to control them. There have been several deadly anti-migrant riots that have been held in several cities in the country. So that's something which is growing, this xenophobia against migrants, and that's something which is really coming from the ground. It's not something which is organized by the authority. And that's something important because Russia is #2 in the world after the US in terms of labor migrants. It's about between 7 and 12 million people, depending how we will calculate them. The majority of them are coming undocumented. They come from the former Soviet Republic, mostly Republic from Central Asia and from Azerbaijan. So they are more or less Russian speakers, not perfectly. They are former Soviet citizens. And this flow of migrants is creating a lot of tension, the same kind of tension you have in the US or we can find in Western Europe, with growing movement of growing anti-migrant narrative. An important movement also that shows that really this xenophobic nationalism was not controlled by the authorities is that it gave rise to someone who has been important in 2011-12, who is less now, Alexei Navalny, who is the main blogger in Russia and who has been considered as the main political opponent of Putin during the anti-regime protest of 2011-2012. Navalny is an interesting case to show how nationalism has been evolving in Russia. He's a very pro-Western person. He thinks that Russia should follow a European model. He's in favor of a democratic, classic parliamentary system. He's relatively pro-American in his view, but he's very xenophobic, and he considers that Russian identity is a kind of white identity that needs to be protected against migrants. He had very tough sentences or speeches against migrants. So that's a good example to see how, and he was very much anti-Putin, explaining that this migration phenomenon in Russia is possible because the regime is corrupt, because Putin himself is corrupt and inefficient, and if Russia was a transparent democratic regime, it would be able to stop migrants and avoid having them in the country. Of course, that wouldn't be the case, but that's part of his narrative. And he was relatively successful in gaining support among middle classes in Russia. So just to show you that not everything is coming from the regime, you also have grassroots movements that are developed. If we look at the sociological survey we have about this kind of grassroots nationalism, we can see two different narratives. The first one is that say that Russia is a specific civilization. And this term of civilization is very important in Russia. Russians have been reading Huntington Clashes of Civilization since it was translated in Russian, and it's really something which is now often part of the narrative of many kind of average citizen. So Russia is seen as a specific civilization, a unique country whose destiny would be to be a great power, whose culture would be very distinct, so the so-called Russian soul, but would also be very universalistic, so having kind of messianic tendencies. And this narrative can take many forms if you really ask people what does that mean to be a specific civilization. Some may insist on the fact that Russia was an empire, some may insist on the fact that Russia was the Soviet Union. Some say that orthodoxy is very important. Some say that religion is not important. Some say that what is most important is Russian culture, is because we had Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, that we give that to the world literature, that we have a specific culture. Some would say that it's more geopolitical. Is Russia the only country able to fight against US domination? So the contents can be different. But globally, it's this idea that Russia is something specific in the world that should be protected. That's the first kind of very consensual definition of Russia that you can find if you look at sociological survey. And that's the same vision that the state has. The state share, or the elites share this vision. So when you look at this kind of argument, you cannot dissociate if it's produced by the state or if it's just the consensual perception of Russian that they have about themselves. Very difficult to know if it's top-down or coming from the grassroots level. The second narrative is about xenophobia. It's saying that Russian national identity is at risk from an invasion of migrants coming from the Southern Republic or coming from China or globally from the Islamic world. And when we look at sociological survey, 2/3 of Russian citizens believe that there are too many migrants in Russia, and they also, like almost the same number, would like them to be expelled, and they call for Russia to have a visa regime with the former Soviet Republic. And this part of the narrative, this part of Russian nationalism is not really supported by the regime. On the contrary, Putin has been relatively open in integrating the other post-Soviet republic. He's not in favor of having a visa regime with the other republic. He's in favor of migrants coming because he knows it's very necessary for the Russian economy to have this cheap workforce. So when you see narrative about Russian national identity that insist on Russia as a civilization, it's very difficult to know if it's produced by the state or if it's just the average perception of Russian citizens. If you see narrative more on xenophobia as Russia as a white power being threatened by the arrival of colored or Islamic people, that's something that is usually more grassroots because the state doesn't support this narrative. And that's where you have this ambiguity, is that you have two kinds of narrative. One is shared by the state and the society. The other seems to be coming more from the society, and it's in fact going against Putin's strategy of trying to reintegrate the post-Soviet space economically. So several conclusions that I wanted to have to show how that the Ukrainian crisis really changed a lot of things for Russia. First, the system, the Russian political regime is still relatively flexible in terms of ideology. Putin has been refusing to select one narrative and to make it mandatory. But the room of maneuver is more and more limited. If you don't share the general narrative about Russia being a great power threatened by the West, then your legitimacy as a political actor will be very limited, if not almost limited to very small liberal circle, and even the majority of liberal circles were in fact sharing the Putin view on the Ukrainian crisis. The regimes try to be a little bit more repressive now, especially in controlling internet. They try to look at what China has been doing. During years, the Russian internet was relatively free. Now it tends to be more and more controlled. The university freedom, also you had very liberal universities in Russia that were really able to have a very anti-regime narrative. They are now under threat, so you can see how things are closing slowly, but still it's very visible since the last months with this issue that the regime is not able to totally close the country. It's still a very open country. You can, you can go away. You can leave it. You can exit the country easily. You can go study abroad. You can still access internet. You can still offshore your money abroad. So it's still a very open country, and that would be very difficult if the regime suddenly decide to totally close it. You cannot create closed society very easily, especially on a big country like that, which is in fact very globalized economically. You cannot become North Korea in just a few months. That would be very difficult and very costly for the regime to close everything. So they have to negotiate about more repression, but not totally repressive system. So it's authoritarian, but at the same time, they don't want to pay the real price of recreating an authoritarian system. So it's a very hybrid regime, and probably Putin is just navigating the best he can to have a kind of the most repressive at the lower cost possible system. Then in terms of national identity, during years, so between the second half of the 2000s until the Ukrainian crisis, the nationalism that was developing in Russia was this xenophobic nationalism focusing on fighting against migrants and considering that if migrants are coming to Russia, that's because the regime is corrupt and therefore Putin is responsible for that. So that has a lot of anti-Putin mobilizing potential, this trend of nationalism that was really embodied by Alexei Navalny. This trend has been totally destroyed by the Ukrainian crisis because it was very difficult. When Russia took Crimea, there was so much consensus among the Russian societies that those who said that they were not in favor of annexing Crimea just lost their credibility, a large part of their political credibility, and Navalny was one of them because he said that he was against the annexation of Crimea. So this xenophobic narrative is now less visible in Russia because all the media attention has been focused on fighting against the West, who is supporting the Ukrainian street revolution and so on. It will probably come back because it's a very global trend that is very powerful in Russia, this anti-migrant trend. So it disappeared from the moment because of the Ukrainian crisis, but it will come back. What also disappeared from the crisis is that during the year there were more and more concern in Russia about the role of China in the region and the fact that China was probably still a friend, but possibly on a long term a competitor in terms of strategic influence and possibly an enemy of Russia in several decades. Now, because this Ukrainian crisis and the focus against the West, US and NATO, China has been totally forbidden. It's seen now as the best friend of Russia because there is no the same kind of geopolitical tension. So once again, a shift back toward the very classic definition of Russian nationalism against the West, and topics of xenophobia, relation to Islam, relation to China being suddenly less visible. But here also, I think it's just an issue of time before it will come back. What seems to me also important is that you have a real dichotomy on the way Russians look at themselves and their place in the world. Geopolitically, the majority of them would say that danger is coming from the West being both, being mostly US and NATO, but also the European Union not being seen as friendly because it's in favor of Ukraine. But if you ask the same people, what are their way of life, how they would like to live, with whom they would compare themselves, then they will all mention European countries and European way of life and living like in Sweden. So you understand there is a kind of schizophrenia of wanting to be as a European country in terms of way of life and values and well-being and welfare state, and geopolitically having to say that the one you want to be like is in fact your geopolitical enemy, and the one with whom you can be geopolitically friendly, Muslim countries, China, are not really the one you compare yourself as a way of life or as a society. So a very kind of difficult dichotomy. Another element to conclude on is that Putin has been able to really try to reconcile all this geopolitical contradiction in Russia by developing a concept that was already very present in Russia, but that was more specified, called the Russian world. And that's really a notion that we will see growing in the years to come, which is to try to say that Russia as a soft power, that it can use, as the US have their own soft power, that Russia can use this soft power and it has its own voices its own voice in the world, both in terms of international affairs, in terms of promoting Russian culture abroad, in terms of promoting information war, and that's something that really has been one of the main focuses of the regimes, which is to try to participate in what they consider is going on, which is this information war against Russia. And if you look at the money that the Russian state have been investing in the Russia Today, in promoting a Russian channel, which is of high quality in terms of its technologies and so on, in promoting counter-narrative, you see that really they are now, so coming back to something that was very present during Soviet time and that disappeared in the 90s and the 2000s, which is the idea that they need to have a counter-narrative from the West on everything, both domestically, internationally, culturally, in terms of identities and values, and they will be investing in that. And of course, the goal is to say that this counter-narrative will be not only in favor of Russia, the country, but that will be accepted by many other people in European countries who would consider that the Russian perception of the world and of conservative value is also their perception. So trying to create friends abroad, and that's something that probably the regime will try to develop in the years to come. And last point to conclude on the long-term strategy, I think when you read the many reports that are published by Russian elites or by Russian institutions, you can see how they are very much aware of the fact that Russia has relatively few friends on the international scene, how the Russian economy is in difficult situation. You can see really very realistic report. Then you can ask, well, that doesn't give any results. I think the problem is that it cannot give any results because reforming the system would be very challenging. The regime would collapse probably if it tried to change, to reform the system. So the Putin strategy has been only to try to gain time, which is to postpone the moment where Russia will have to make a real choice in terms of its economic development, of its strategic development. So they are just trying to gain time. And of course, the sanctions that are now in place against Russia and that probably will remain for a long time because they are linked to getting Crimea back, which will probably not happen, will have a long-term impact on Russia. And we already see the impact in terms of everyday life. It's really the way of life of the middle classes in big cities has been impacted by the sanction and the counter-sanction that Russia put on European food products, for example. But now it seems that many long-term industrial development projects of Russia will be also going slow down because of the sanction, and the Russian state consider it needs 2 to 5 years to try to reshape its economic partnership with Asian countries, but at the same time partnering with China, India, and Vietnam that doesn't give you exactly the same skills that having US or European firms working in your country, not the same kind of high-tech, not the same kind of technology, knows how, and so on. So I think on the long term, the regime is now very much aware, and they were aware of that even before, that their long-term legitimacy is really on preserving the way of life that they have been able to offer to the Russian citizen in the 2000s. If they fail economically, and they could fail because you know that the Russian economy is really based on the price of oil, and the price of oil is decreasing, which means that if it's continue like that, the state reserve, the budget of the Russian state will be decreasing, while all its expenses, both because of the sanction, but also because of pensions and the money it has to pay to maintain the Soviet legacy in terms of industries and infrastructure. These spendings are more and more costly, while the revenue should probably be decreasing in the years to come, except if they are able to make a drastic shift toward Asia. But the problem is that shifting toward Asia, it's a kind of medium-term perspective. It's 5 to 10 to 15 years, while the money shortage can be in a very 3 to 5 to 10 years. And so they will have to negotiate probably in 2, 3, or 5 years some difficult moment in terms of being able to preserve the quality of life they have been able to offer to their own citizens. And of course, as very often, I mean, the real legitimacy of the Putin regime, it's not ideology or nationalism. The real legitimacy of the regime is its ability to offer a standard of living to the population. So probably the regime will be forced to become more repressive and probably ideologize more the public space in order to compensate for the probable difficult years in terms of economic development that the country will have to face. So probably interesting years to come in the way Russia and Putin regime will have to navigate both the sanction and its domestic legitimacy that will be more and more under questions. And maybe I will stop here because I spoke already a lot and we want to have some questions.
Perfect.
So thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay, we've gotten a lot to think about here, and let me see what kind of questions students want to pose.
What you felt would be possibility of him shifting towards the side that would prefer to see more strength on Ukraine and the absorption.
Well, that seems to me, I don't think that's the plan for Russia, but at the same time, I mean, taking Crimea was also not the plan probably before it happened. So Putin is a good strategist in the sense that he takes opportunities when he sees it. I think now that the conflict in Ukraine is frozen, he doesn't have any interest in trying to take eastern Ukraine. He doesn't have interest in trying to aggravate the situation internationally for Russia. It doesn't need more sanctions. It doesn't need more tension internationally with the US or with Europe. Taking Eastern Ukraine would just mean more problems, and it wouldn't bring any good solution. Leaving Eastern Ukraine as it is now, that is at the frozen conflict, that's the best they can have, because that's just undermining Ukraine, mostly without Russia having to take responsibility for an annexation that would have been difficult. Crimea was the perfect annexation because it was done in less than 2 weeks with nothing. What happened in Eastern Ukraine was a real civil war. It will be very difficult to rebuild the industrial sector that has been largely destroyed. People have left. It would be very difficult to invest we already know that Crimea is costing a lot of money and that several projects in other regions have been stopped because they have to send money to Crimea. If they want to really integrate Eastern Ukraine, it's a huge industrial region. It's very costly to have all this mining sector reshaped. That would be very costly. That would create more tension. No interest. The good interest is to let the things as it is, and Ukraine will take years to try to recreate a unified state. So I don't think it will happen.
Okay, we'll take questions both from the room here and also from Embry-Riddle students. If there are any students in Daytona who want to ask a question, please raise your hand or come forward to the mic. So questions here in the lane for the moment? Yeah, good.
I know one of the things you touched on is Putin's administration kind of kicking the can down the road on the economic change that is needed. Do you believe that any time within the next 4 to 6 years that problem would be looked at by the administration? And if so, do you believe that would open the door for a possible color revolution in Russia for more of a democratized government?
Well, I think for the moment, economic reforms are no more really one of the main goal of the government. It was really discussed during Medvedev's presidency, and now it has totally stopped. So I think now the Russian state strategy is that, I mean, reforming drastically the way the Russian economy function would be terribly costly, both economically and socially. That would be like a new collapse of the Soviet Union. That would be a big trauma. So the goal is to avoid that at any price. The way to avoid that is to inject the more money you can from all revenue, just to postpone the way you have to take that decision, and to try to have a private sector that will be developing in parallel to the public industrial Soviet legacy system. You cannot reform the industrial Soviet system, but you can just parallelize it with the private sector that will bring more money and offer services and be more efficient. This private sector is growing, But to make it grow, you need an open country with a globalized economy, with more or less a business climate that is functional, and therefore this private sector is now very much touched by the sanction. So if they try to close the country, they will lose this private sector and just have to rely on the public sector that is not functional. And if they close the country, they have to rely on the public sector that they cannot reform, and that doesn't bring enough work. So it's a kind of, I mean, you don't have, it's a vicious circle. You don't have clear solution. And I think, in fact, no one really has. It would be very difficult, even with a good political will. And I think the people will probably go back on the street for economic reason, probably, but also because now you have this middle class that wants more than just economic improvement. They want good school, good higher education institution. They don't want to have to bribe people when they go to the state administration of the police. So they want an improvement of their quality of life. The Russian state was very good in the 2000s to give more money to the citizens, because that was linked to oil revenue. So once you have more money, you can redistribute it easily. But when you need to change the quality of life and the quality of institution to your citizen, you need political will to reform yourself and not only money. In fact, this regime has not really been able to reform itself. It was able to distribute more money. And so one day or another, that will not be enough for these middle classes, and they will be asking for more. The problem is that for the moment, they don't go in the streets, they leave the country. The level of immigration is once again one of the highest in the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the offshoring of money is something which is just incredible. It's hundreds of billions of dollars leaving the country. So the risk of this country is not to have a street revolution, it's just to have all its human capital leaving.
Anybody in Daytona, Embry-Riddle? No? Okay. Sorry.
The back. Can you hear me?
We hear you just fine. Yeah.
Sort of? Okay, I'll try. I have 2 points. 1 point, 1 question. I would be really interested to hear your thoughts on the quote free and fair election idea. I know the election, in the most recent election in the eastern Ukraine, they've had a hard time getting internationally recognized elections monitors to legitimize the outcomes. And so I would love to hear your comments on that. And then I was also wondering what you thought about the relationship the current sanctions would have on what you call the closure of Russia. So I would love to get your insights on those.
Mm-hmm. Well, on the election in eastern Ukraine, and that's where we go back to the conservative turn I was mentioning, is that since the Crimea referendum and until the election in eastern Ukraine, the only groups that are non-Russian that come to validate this election are the far right, the Western European far right party, who are sending monitoring people, and that's really impressive. There are now several groups in Europe that try to parallelize OSCE and to say that they are the kind of alternative to OSCE monitoring election, and they are all clearly far right parties. And probably some of them are funded by Russia, or they'll do that by Ideologi, but they have been the only one validating the Crimean referendum and the only one validating the Eastern Ukraine referendum, plus, of course, the Russian creation of CIS Electoral Committee, or the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Election Committee, so they are all kind of pro-Russian. But coming from abroad, the only legitimacy we can get is the one that is organized by European far-right party. And in terms of closure of Russia and the sanction, there have been a lot of debates in Russia about maybe the sanction could help the Russian economy to develop itself, because there will be less competition coming from abroad, from European market, and therefore that would force the Russian firms to develop their own market. It's also helping some of the Central Asian food industries to occupy some niches, because there is no more I don't know, European cheese or apples, and therefore the Kazakh apples can come and occupy the market. I'm not sure the middle classes in Russia see they are also very much taking care of brand and so on. But so I think there is this hope in Russia that the sanction will in fact de-globalize partly the Russian economy and force Russian firms to reform themselves and to try to create a more protectionist economy where they would be more or less self-sufficient. The problem is that it can work in some specific sector. Is there food industry? Probably, yeah, food, agribusiness is a sector that would benefit from the sanction. Maybe some kind of, I don't know, car industry, for example. But the big issues where you need the know-how, the technical knowledge from Western firms, they cannot invent it from scratch, and China or India cannot give it to them. So I think that would be very difficult for them to totally reform and transform this closure into something positive. And the main issue, and that's also something that was discussed, is that Putin could have thought that, that when the sanction were put in place, and especially against the banking system, the idea that it would probably help Putin fighting against his own oligarchs, offshoring money and trying to be sure that money will not fly away anymore because the Russian banking system would in a sense become closed to the rest of the world. For the moment, it didn't happen, so money continued to leave the country, and we don't really see, but you need several months to see the kind of long-term economic impact of the sanctions, so maybe in a few months.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mr.
I have a two-fold question. So one is the shooting down of the Malaysian airlines that happened, which seems to have unified the European and American approach towards Russia. Could you please comment on that in terms of Russians' ideology and the narrative they place it in? And I think just recently, like a couple of days ago, there was the gas pipeline conflict between Ukraine and Russia has been settled. Please comment on that too.
Well, on the Malaysian airlines, that was really, I mean, the Russian interpretation, and that's something very serious everywhere in the post-Soviet space. It's very much based on conspirological narrative, and it's taken, I mean, we often smile, but it's a very serious way of looking at the world. I mean, if it's the one which is shaping your world perception, then it's very efficient. So the Russian narrative was that it was probably, or it was either done by the Ukrainian government, or it was organized to be sure that there will be European unity against Russia, and the fact that it was a plane with mostly European and not American, that's part of the Russian narrative to say that maybe it was organized because Europe was not unified enough, and after that, and that's true that after that, I mean, Angela Merkel shifted her narrative in being clearly mostly more anti-Putin and stronger toward Russia, because they know very well that in Europe you really have to take care of your own public opinion on these kind of issues. I mean, it could have been the same things here. So this conspirological narrative is really framing the global Russian perception, and that's something which is largely shared by the population also. And I think that would be reducing to consider that it's only, it's only Russian propaganda, Russian media propaganda. Well, it's more than that, because people really believe that, and it has been the way they have been looking at the world since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that's a very deep feeling, because when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was never offered a kind of public narrative that would have acknowledged what happened clearly. And therefore, if you don't have a narrative that tell you why these incredible things happen suddenly in few months, then conspirology, the good way of trying to understand things, is that you look for hidden argument that people don't want to give to you to interpret the world. And then on the gas settlement, I think that was very important for Europe to be sure it would be signed before the winter. I mean, it's important for Ukrainian, but for Europe, I mean, who really cares about the Ukrainian? Europeans cared about also themselves, and they want to avoid a political crisis in their own countries. So it was very important and also it was good to show that Russia was coming back to the table of discussion and could be a pragmatic partner with whom you negotiate something concrete, you pay, and that will work. So I think everybody wanted it to work, Ukraine, Russia, and Europeans. So they were able to have it working. It will also, I think also on the Russian side, it was a sign, it was a sign of pragmatism, because Russians became very concerned about Ukraine not getting any international monetary fund loan if they were unable to have an elected government, then a coalition, and then to settle the gas crisis. So if they also want, because you understand that on the long term, it's also not good for Russia to have a collapsed Ukrainian economy, because it's an important partner of Russia, not only in terms of gas, but of many other things. So they may want to weaken the Ukrainian state. They also need it to be relatively a little bit functional economically. So everybody had interest in finding a solution. But that also means that if we are able to find a gas agreement with Russia where Europe, Russia, Ukraine agree, it also means that in a sense Ukraine lost the political battle, because what Europe cares about is to sign an agreement with Russia, and whatever happened to Crimea and eastern Ukraine is a kind of, it's put on the side, or it's become a kind of long-term issue. That's where Russia really succeeded in frozen the conflict, is that we know it will take years to be solved, and now in a sense it's no more on the real short-term political agenda while gas issues were. So.
I just saw an article, I think it was there yesterday on Bloomberg, about this notion that's emerging through the visits of several Chinese officials to Central Asian states about the reconstruction of the Silk Road, and this idea that through cultural, economic, political ties, China wants to reconstruct its own kind of space within this area. And so I'm wondering, how does the Russian regime deal with that?
Well, this Chinese Silk Road strategy was in place already a few years ago, so it's not directly linked to the Ukrainian crisis. The Chinese president visited the 5 Central Asian countries last year, and he also had the same narrative about Chinese Silk Road in the region and giving billions of dollars of economic investment and ahead in the region. So that's very much, that's really what the Chinese are trying to do. They don't want any political influence for the moment. They just, because they know that political influence is always conflictual and difficult, and they just need economic influence, and the rest is not so important in the Chinese perception. So clearly for Russia it's of concern, and that's probably why Russia developed this custom union, Eurasian Union strategy, that they cannot avoid China to trade with Central Asia, because no one can avoid China to trade, but they can try to maintain a regional integration that would make that Central Asia would trade with China, but geopolitically would still be part of the Russian world. And that's a fair strategy, because they cannot compete with China. The only thing they can offer is regional integration to slow down the impact of the political impact that Chinese economic influence would have one day or another on the region. So now, of course, because of the Ukrainian crisis, the Central Asian regimes are very much concerned about how things could develop. So, of course, they welcome even more than before kind of Chinese high-level visits, because it's also helped them to show Russia that they have other partners. But, and you may have followed that, for example, there has been a kind of tough exchange of words between Nazarbayev and Putin. Nazarbayev, the president of Kazakhstan, said that, well, his country was part of the Eurasian Economic Union, but if one day this is no more good for the economy of Kazakhstan, then he can always leave the union, because that's, union are done for that. You can enter, but you can also leave if it doesn't bring good things to your economy. And then the week after, Putin replied by saying that Nazarbayev is really a great president because he was able to create a state in a country that never had any statehood. So something very that has been creating a lot of tensions in Kazakhstan, because of course Kazakhs interpreted it as a very kind of sign of disdain from Russia toward the Kazakh independence, and of course they put themselves in parallel with what happened to Ukraine. So,
can I just add to that be part of this Chinese investment, of course, is in long-term projects like infrastructure, new roads, new rails, pipelines. All of those things will link the Central Asian economies and populations to China over the long term. So these will pay dividends not just over 5 or 10 years, but maybe over 50.
Yeah.
The Chinese are
And the Central Asians official often made that comment that Russia is so much acting on short-term issues, like, you know, Putin until his next election, or our own Central Asian president until the next election. China is investing on, at least 50 years, if not one century, and we will not have to pay the dividend. The political price will arrive only in a few decades, and nobody knows what will be the political price. So that's also the way they see their own situation between Russia, short-term Russia and long-term China.
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. Okay. Knowing what you know about Russia and how its politics function, and also taking into account the actual best interest of the United States that is maintaining and furthering the status quo of liberal capitalist democracy, what would be the best policy for the United States in the situation in Ukraine?
That's the tough question.
Did you all hear that in Daytona Beach? The question was about what should the United States do vis-a-vis President Putin to further the interest of the U.S. to maintain what the questioner called a liberal capitalist order or something like that. Whatever. Yeah.
Well, I think the room of maneuver for the U.S. is in fact very limited, because it's almost impossible to apply from abroad or to really implement from abroad policy that would really make a change in these countries. So I think globally, the US strategy toward Ukraine since the beginning of the crisis has been relatively inefficient, because you cannot support financially reforming the Ukrainian economy. You cannot ask Europe to do that because Europe doesn't have the money neither to do that. So US is projecting something that it cannot really pay for, and that's contributing, I mean, that's really my personal opinion, that's contributing to the discredit of the US narrative as being a kind of geopolitical actor that is enabled, when things are really going on the ground, to make a change. And you have to understand that seen from the post-Soviet perspective everywhere in these countries, this is very much linked to what is considered as US failure in Afghanistan, US failure in Iraq, US failure in Syria, and that's just one more failure. That's the way it is interpreted, that we say a lot of things, we cannot really make change on the ground because we don't have the money or the possibility, or just because even if you have the money, the possibility, and the will, you just cannot impact other countries. So I think on the long term, there is really an issue of trust. Clearly, I think the Ukrainian population is largely also distrustful about what can be really the help coming from the US, and also partly from the European side. And then really dealing with Russia, well, marginalizing Russia is not a good strategy. I mean, it's not North Korea, it's not Iran, it's a country where, which is still largely globalized, largely open, with elites, with middle classes, with a lot of things. So I'm in favor of maintaining dialogue with Russia. And also, I mean, you know, the way the crisis has been so much portrayed in black and white as really democracy against authoritarianism, I think it missed a lot of the elements and a lot of what was the Russian perspective on the side. And I don't think if we really want to be influential on the long term, and there are many people in Russia who really want to maintain dialogue with the US. So the point is really on our side. The Russian side is still very much open to that. I think there are room for improvement. But the long-term issue, I would say, is the kind of lack of trust in many of these countries about what is the long-term Russian US involvement. The same for Central Asia. If you ask the Central Asian state, well, no one will take any risk in the name of friendship with the US against Russia or China, because you're never sure the US will still be there, while you are sure Russia and China would still. So that seems to me, they have a very pragmatic conception of international relations, kind of real politics.
Sorry, let me see if there are any questions at Embry-Riddle.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi. I'd like to hear your thoughts on the narrative regarding fascist participation in the Maidan Street protests. Do you see them as accurate, valid, as well as the participation of right-wing fascist battalions in the war, such as the Azov battalion. And following that, considering the political and the bloodshed, I don't think it will ever be possible for Ukraine to unite again.
Well, I think two different elements. Russia always tend to portray whatever was happening in Kiev as being organized by Ukrainian nationalists because it's a kind of old historical narrative. So the crisis happened, and of course this Russian interpretation about the fascist or neo-Nazi coup organized on US money in Kiev was something that was very easy to develop because you have all this memory of the Second World War, which is still very powerful in Russia and even in Central Asia. The majority of Central Asians follow totally the Russian narrative on that, considering that it's really fascist people who took power in Kiev. So Russia has been very good in playing on this Second World War memory issues in trying to frame the political contemporary events with this kind of historical memory. After what was on the ground, you had real nationalist, Ukrainian nationalist group on the ground that play a role, but they were just one among many others. You understand that the point for Russia, the point for the Russian regime is not to portray the Ukrainian revolution as being a democratic event, which means if it's democratic, it means you have many groups that have been fighting Maidan. Nationalists, liberals, you also have leftists, I don't know, anarchist group fighting against the corrupt regime. So Russia will never point out this diversity of opinion. It will always point out the fascist group. But clearly, both on the Ukrainian side and in eastern Ukraine, you have fascist group really in the sense of international fascist group from Western and Central Europe who has been fighting on both sides. You have skinheads and neo-Nazi from all over Europe fighting on both sides. And what is interesting is that you even have Russian skinhead groups who have been fighting on both sides. So those who have been fighting on the Russian Eastern Ukraine side, you understand, but you have some Russians who are fighting on the Ukrainian side against Russia, which is really an interesting sign of how all this very small neo-Nazi scene in Europe has been drastically reshaped by the Ukrainian crisis, mostly because it's so rare to have a war theater in Europe that, of course, for all these kind of violent subgroups, it's a good way to train. But I think the fascist narrative has been really powerful in Russia, and of course it forced Ukraine to have a kind of counter-narrative that is also sometimes probably will be too extreme, which is that when Ukraine will have to recreate its own national identity narrative, they will have difficulties in integrating this accusation of being fascist with a small nationalist group that were part of it. So.
I think we're getting to the end of time, but maybe one more question.
I wanted to ask you about the role of the youth, especially in terms of the Russian narrative that Putin's trying to formulate and the conservative ideology he's trying to push. Like, how are the youth being socialized into this? Are they in opposition to it? Are they supportive of it? If they're in opposition to it, are they likely to shake off Putin's Russia in the following years?
Well, youth in Russia, that's a good question, has been very polarized. So clearly the liberal groups are mostly young people or relatively young generation, but very of the conservative people are also young people. So it's very polarized. The main driving force of nationalism and nationalist ideology in Russia are youth group or people in their 30s, so young. So it's not only a Soviet nostalgia phenomenon, or it can be a Soviet nostalgia, but it's for people who didn't know what was the Soviet Union. So it's more complex than just a generational gap. So, if, for example, in terms of sociological survey, youth is much more xenophobic than older people. Very often they can be, it's good in the sense that they are more politicized or more engaged in ideology, but it can be on both sides, both liberal and both nationalist. So I think on the long term, that will be really, they will be the one shaping. We will really see a kind of polarization of the Russian public opinion because this youth is becoming more and more powerful. The point is that also this youth can be very pragmatic, and they are the one with human capital and they are the one with money, compared to their older generation. The youth is largely is richer than older generation in Russia, and they are the one leaving the country. So in fact, you have a kind of triangle. You have more nationalists, more liberal, but you have also more people who are just leaving the country and you are not sure they will come back. So that's probably where the future of this country is between this triangle of more conservative, more liberal, or just leaving and losing hope for reforming the country.
Well, thanks very much. It's really easy to think when you sometimes hear people that this is a return to the Soviet Union. This is a remaking of the Soviet era. And I think Marlene has shown us today how much more complicated it is than that. Somebody who's been studying the Soviet or studied the Soviet Union beginning in the Brezhnev era, it's sometimes disorienting to think how far we've come in some ways over the last 40 years. But you've brought us to an important and kind of disturbing moment. But again, it's one that makes us realize that when we talk about things, these very simple narratives about reconstructing the Soviet Union just aren't right at all. We thank you very much for a very stimulating and informative evening or afternoon, late afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks to the audience here and also in Daytona and Embry-Riddle. Thanks again. Thanks,